Okay, so let's talk about thread now. And I feel like this is one of the big disconnects that we don't think about when we think about issues with our sewing machine or with how our sewing turns out. But having been behind the service bench for so long, I have recognized how much trouble thread can cause you when you don't realize it. So let's start with talking about the difference between types of thread. So on the left here, you have Orifil, which is the beige. This is a 50 weight Orifil. Gutermann is the pink, Metler is the green, and then the blue on the right is the dual duty. So the difference between these two types of thread is the thread on the left is called a long staple cotton. So it's really, to me, it's been difficult to really define the difference between the two. So I looked up the definition real quick for those that are curious. So the difference between short and long staple cotton, staples are considered short, long, or extra long. Shorter boll fibers are referred to as short staple, and the longer boll fibers are referred to as long staple or extra long staple. The longer the fibers, the softer and more durable the cotton. So really it has to do not just with the manufacturing process on how they treat the thread, but it also has to do with what part of the cotton boll that they use. If you've ever looked at one, of course, the bowls with the longer staple cotton take much longer to nurture and grow. And that's what makes it slightly more expensive than a short staple cotton. So that's where Coates and Clark gets to be a little bit cheaper. Actually, it's not. I'm going to show you a comparison in this video on the cost, but Coates and Clark is kind of manufactured in a much more cheap manner than the long staple cotton. So those are the two big differences. With short staple cotton, it has a tendency to break or snap more than something with the long staple cotton. So long staple cotton is also considered like Egyptian cotton that you would find in sheets. So it's softer, more durable, less linty. So that's the big difference. I always recommend long staple cotton, especially if you are a quilter. For some reason, that does better. There are places for Coates and Clark, but for those of you that are quilters, I'm always going to recommend a long staple cotton, and it's going to be in this order. I always recommend Orifil first. It is my absolute favorite brand, and from a technician standpoint, it's going to put the least amount of lint into your machine. So that's going to cut down on any issues that you have due to lint. It's going to help your service last a little longer. It keeps the lint off your computer boards and off of your lubricant. Gutermann, I always recommend because it's at least available pretty much in every Joann's or craft store. And sometimes you can use a coupon or find it on sale. Metler also has to be purchased at a quilt shop or through a dealer. And to me, Metler is also the hardest one to find, but it also is the most linty of the three that I recommend here. So let's look at long staple threads. Now, these images are courtesy of Nancy Purvis, who used to have a blog called Owen's Olivia. I'm pretty sure that she doesn't do her blog anymore, but I appreciate that she allows me to use these images for education. Her husband is a scientist and graciously put some thread under a microscope for us. So you're going to see the red on red here, and that's because of the nature of the microscope. But what we're looking at here is the Orifil 100% cotton in the 50 weight that I absolutely recommend for most sewing jobs and piecing. So you can see the twist, which are these little segments of thread here. And if you were looking at the edges out here, there is some shadow, but we don't see any erratic threads or any kind of blur from like lint. Next, we have Gutermann, which again is my second most popular recommendation. And while the twist looks really good, if you look at the edges, you can start to see shadows of little fibers appearing around the edges. I don't mind Gutermann. The one time I really don't like Gutermann is when I'm hand sewing binding on a quilt, which I do frequently. I get way more knots and more issues with Gutermann, and I think it's because it does put out more lint than Orifil. And then third, we have Metler, which says silk finish, a cotton silk finish, still a cotton thread. I don't know why this one is colored differently or came out differently, but I think she might have did it to access or to really showcase how much lint and how much loose fibers are floating around here on the outside edge of the thread. So if you look at these three in comparison, I would say that Orifil and Gutermann so far are very close, but they do get progressively lintier and with more loose fibers. So for short staple cottons, in comparison, this is Coates and Clark under the microscope, which is kind of crazy. If you look how loose, and I am going to put up a comparison side by side of these pictures and the long staple in just a minute, but look at all these crazy erratic threads and fibers floating around out here. I realize it's under a microscope, so it's bigger, but that's crazy to me to see that many fibers. And then even worse is the bargain bin, which is usually found at the edge of the cutting counter at Joann's. I never ever recommend that bargain bin. For one, it is the cheapest, crappiest thread you're ever going to get and will probably drive you crazy. But also, when you cut fabric like they do at Joann's, all those fibers from the loose edges float around in the environment. Eventually, they have to settle somewhere. And sometimes because of static electricity and just normal circumstances, that those fibers are going to land in that little basket of discount thread there. I also don't recommend unknown brands from Amazon or Wallwack. I know that you can get Aurifil from Wallwack, and I know we're all trying to get a deal. I don't. It does bother me because they're taking advantage of Aurifil and kind of those are supposed to be sent by or sold by dealers, but they do have some no-name brands. Now, the problem with using bargain thread from other places and sources you don't know is that a lot of places will these manufacturing companies will take the remnants that didn't make it through the manufacturing process, and they find ways to glue those short pieces together to give you a spool of thread. For you as the user, that's going to frustrate the living daylights out of you because when it's running through your machine, you're going to have more unexplained thread breaks, snags, thread nesting, especially when you buy bargain embroidery thread. I find that to be, we actually found out that a local business in Atlanta was selling those remnants, but not telling their customers. So we had a hard time figuring out why so many people had a particular issue with one brand of thread. So I don't recommend skimping too much on your thread. Now here is the Orfil and the Gutermann side by side with the Coates and Clark and the bargain bin. So you can see very clearly difference in the twist and the tightness of it and the fibers compared to each other. So it almost looks a little bit unhinged crazy there when you can see them side by side. So let's talk about the twist. More twist means lose like more means it's going to be a tighter thread. It's going to have less lint. The twist, when it's running through your machine and going through those thread guides, is what causes that lint to unleash. And then it sticks to the lubricant in your machine. It goes to your computer board. So we want the least amount lint possible. So if you look at these three, this is Mettler, Orfil, and Superior. And again, I didn't have any kind of choice on what thread brand she chose to showcase, but in the middle is Orfil, which is my highest recommendation for thread, which looks pretty solid. Mettler to the left looks a lot looser and more linty. And then Superior on the right is interesting to me because I don't usually use Superior in a cotton, but you can still see that there's a lot of fibers floating around in Superior. Now, this brings me to a second point that I'm seeing a huge trend that I fully support happening. This started on my radar sometime around 2020. From 2020 to 2022, I was supporting a dealer as a service shop, and that dealer was very heavy into embroidery and embroidery machines. So we started to notice that these shops were promoting polyester thread as a piecing thread for quilters. And there's all these things floating around out there, but you can't iron it the same because it'll break down the polyester. That is absolutely not true. What people are drawn to is that it's a lot smoother going through your machine, and it's so it's not, when you're using a polyester thread, a good high quality thread, it's not going to leave any lint in your machine. You have less thread breaks. You definitely have less issues overall with embroidery thread. So yes, you can use embroidery thread or polyester thread when you're piecing blocks or quilts or anything else. I don't know about garment. I'm not a garment specialist, but you don't have to use a cotton thread just because you're sewing on cotton. So keep that in mind. Glide is a brand that I highly recommend because it's so economical if you need to buy a lot of colors. But really, Isocord, all of those other brands that you can find, I highly recommend. Again, I don't recommend all of the bargain discounts and whatnot of unknown thread on the internet, but I do recommend you trying the polyester and see if you like it better. So let's talk about the cost difference because I've been accused of being a thread snob, which I don't consider myself a snob at all. If you know me in person, I do not wear labels. I'm not that person, so I don't care about fancy thread. I just like what's good for the machine. So Orifil is usually sold on a spool that has 1,422 yards, which is exactly the spool that you see here. The average cost for one of these spools has gone up. It's about $15.50, which I know is what makes people gasp with like, that's some really expensive thread. But if you do the math, that comes out to being 1 cent, literally on the dime, 1 cent per yard. If you look at Coates and Clark, the average cost of their standard spool is $3.49, and you can see it has 250 yards on it. That comes out to being just barely over 1 cent. So while you're not having a big giant savings, I could tell you a few years ago you did have savings because we were probably paying $12 to $13 a spool with Orifil. You're coming out and breaking even. The reason why the Coates and Clark feels cheaper is you're only buying 250 yards at a time as opposed to paying for all of this thread up front. So if you're the type of person that needs a whole lot of colors, I get it. Coates and Clark might make sense. I still have a problem with the quality. But if you use the same color for quilt piecing or whatever, that's how I am. I just go ahead and buy all of it up front. I have the better quality thread and it's really not that much more expensive than Coates and Clark. So this is my way to advocate for you to think about buying a better, higher quality thread. One thing I wanted to share before I close this out, I usually, when I'm giving this lecture at the quilt guilds, this is probably everybody's favorite part because it kind of blows their mind. And I want to mention it here because it does have a tendency to improve your quality of sewing time with cotton thread. I recommend conditioning your cotton thread. So even if it's not old, but if it's old thread, you might be able to save it. What you see here is that big cone of Orifil thread that I had mentioned previously. I don't remember how much these retail for and how much they're on there, but if you use the same color of thread for just about everything, it's definitely worth it to invest in one of these cones. So this particular picture you see here is set up to condition one of these cones. Don't use this much mineral oil when you're using a regular spool of thread. But what you're going to do is get some regular mineral oil, which is just what you find in the digestive aisle at the grocery store or at Walmart or wherever. And no, this is not going to ruin your machine or be a problem. If you don't know already, sewing machine oil is just a super, super, super refined version of mineral oil. That being said, I never ever recommend that you lubricate your machine with mineral oil either. And that's because it still has impurities in it that will get really sticky and creates all kinds of problems in your machine. So do not lubricate any part of your machine with mineral oil. However, putting this in your thread will not cause any problems with your machine at all. Second to that, is that it's not going to leave any residue in your fabric. It's not going to transfer to your fabric. You're not going to find oil on anything inside your machine or in any way, shape, or form. When you first dip this into the mineral oil for a few days, the thread is definitely going to be slightly darker than its original color. You can still sew with it while it's darker, but as that thread takes several days to get into the core of the thread strand, it will even out to be its original color again. So you can just dip this. What you're going to do is take your spool or your cone, dip it into fully into the mineral oil just real quick, pull it back out, let the excess drip off there, and then take a paper towel and you're going to pat dry the spool. You don't want to rub it or mess up the threads on the spool, but you just want to pat it dry and get the excess off. Then leave it sitting on a paper towel for a good 30 minutes at the minimum. I personally prefer to give it a couple hours at the minimum, and then usually 2 to 3 days is my preference. So as soon as I go to the store and buy a new spool of thread, I go ahead and dip it, and then I leave it sitting, and it's ready when I'm ready. Make sure that you get all the oil off the plastic and everything else, but you really don't want to disturb those threads. And what's going to happen, like especially on one of these big cones, the oil can only get so far into a cone like this. So you will see that it's going to sew for a long time with the lubricated part. And I guarantee you, when you get to the parts that are not lubricated, you will hear a difference when it's moving through your sewing machine. At that point on one of these cones, when you start to get to the point where the oil is gone, go ahead and just redip it and start the process all over again. So I wish that I'd been able to do this demo here, but if you would like to see the entire process and how it's done, you will find a full video tutorial at sewingdocacademy.com and also on our YouTube channel at Sewing Doc Academy. And if you do have any questions about this or any part of the thread choosing process or what you should use, feel free to drop a comment below, and I will be very happy to help you.